All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 12:14. We see our attendees rolling on in. So we're going to go over here and start sending some hellos to everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. Please let us know where you're from if you have access to the chat. Oh, hi. We have Houston, Lumberton ISD, Kilgore, Sonia, Deborah, DeSoto. They're flying in faster, Christina, than I can read them all.
Yeah, it's going in fast. Hi, everybody. We're so glad you could join us today.
Hi. Welcome, everybody. It looks like great participation from across the state. Thank you so much.
Austin, Pearland.
Uh-huh.
So I can't talk today. Pittsburgh, El Paso. Yeah, everywhere across the state.
Fresno.
Nice.
Wow. All right. Thanks, guys. We appreciate everyone being here this afternoon. You can keep it coming. We're going to just give another moment or two to let the audience populate so everyone can receive this great information we have to share with y'all today. So it'll be just another minute.
Somebody from my neck of the woods. Got Brandy in Lumberton. Hi, Brandy. I'm in Orange, so Region 5. Yeah.
All right, cool. Corpus Christi. Oh, Harmony Public Schools. Hi. There's Brandy. Thank y'all so much for taking time out of your day to join us for today's webinar. So at this juncture, it is now 12:16. So we are going to pass the moment over to Sarah Untersee. She is our school family community engagement consultant here at Region 10. Prior to that, I'm going to share my name. My name is Gracie Whitley. I work with SpedTex at Region 10. And also, Christina Henning, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Christina Henning. I'm with Partners Resource Network, Parent Training and Information Centers for the state of Texas, and I'm the Director of Statewide Services there.
All righty. And on the SpedTex team, we also have Janetta McGuire here. We have Brian. He is the Black and White Block, R10. He's our technology support. We have April Estrada and Christina on your side. Who do you have with you?
I have Stephanie McLaughlin. She's our training and evaluation specialist at Partners Resource Network.
Awesome. And of course, our presenter, Kristin McGuire, is here, and we will introduce her formally in just a moment, along with Huck Spear, both from Texas Education Agency. So at this juncture, we are going to pause and let Sarah begin our webinar today. Sarah?
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Whitley. We are so happy to have you here. Welcome to today's statewide webinar hosted by SpedTex and Partners Resource Network. Like Dr. Whitley said, my name is Sarah Untersee, and I am part of the SpedTex team. The topic for today's webinar is special education updates with Kristin McGuire. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. If you do need technical assistance during today's webinar, we do have Brian Wilson with us today from Region 10 to provide that support. He is the black and white box that you might see on your Zoom screen, and you can send him a chat message if you need any help. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the SpedTex website. It usually takes about a week or so in order for that to be posted, but we will drop our website link in the chat so that you are able to access that once it becomes available. Although time does not allow for live questions and answers today, you are welcome to put any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, and we will pass those along to our presenters following the webinar. SpedTex is the Special Education Information Center for Texas. We're a collaborative project between Region 10 Education Service Center and the Texas Education Agency. We help parents to understand their rights and responsibilities under IDEA and facilitate collaboration when there are concerns between the parent and the school district. We also serve as a resource for educators. We offer support via phone, email, or live chat for families and professionals. We offer webinars and other resources as well. Our contact information is on the screen. I am now going to turn it over to Stephanie McLaughlin to share some additional information about Partners Resource Network.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Stephanie McLaughlin. I am the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network. We are the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of Parent Training and Information Centers, or PTIs. PTIs are funded through the Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. And in Texas, there are 4. They are known as PACT, PATH, PIN, and TEAM. Our mission at Partners Resource Network is to empower and support Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or special healthcare needs. And we do this through a network of highly skilled, regionally located coordinators who are knowledgeable in local policies, services, and resources, as well as state and national guidelines. We provide training, information, and one-on-one assistance at no cost to Texas families and youth. We serve parents of children and youth with disabilities from birth to age 26, as well as youth self-advocates between the ages of 14 and 26. All of our services are provided in English and Spanish. And for more information, check out our website at prntexas.org. And you can also like and follow us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at prntexas.
Hey, we are excited to welcome our presenter, Kristin McGuire. Kristin currently serves as the Senior Director of the Special Populations Policy, Reporting, and Technical Assistance Division at the Texas Education Agency. Prior to her role at the agency, she served as the Director of Governmental Relations at the Texas Council of Administrators of Special Education for 5 years, and as a policy consultant and analyst at the Texas Association of School Boards for about 10 years prior to that. She launched her career in special education by becoming a special education teacher after working in various nonprofit social services companies. Kristin continued to advance as an educator to a district-level position before moving to the state education policy arena. At this point, I am going to stop sharing and I am going to turn it over to Kristin. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. I am happy to be here. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Kristin McGuire with TEA. I don't know why today I realized that, but I am 1 year and 1 day into my tenure at TEA. So happy to be here. I know many of you have had the pleasure of hearing from my awesome supervisor, Dr. Justin Porter. And in fact, I was with him on, I think, our last webinar here. So just wanted to say hello and thank you for joining us. And thanks for having me here. I know we have a wide variety of audience members, from parents to employees of our local education agencies and from other interested stakeholders. So I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I do want to mention that let's see, let me make sure I am sharing before I do that. We did get some questions for me. Let me make sure I am in slideshow mode. Hopefully you're seeing that. So you guys break in and tell me if you're not. I did get some questions sent to us prior to this. They were sent several weeks ago. So these were kind of the most requested questions at the time. And so I wanted to just first, before I get started with those questions, I wanted to mention a couple of things. First, I wanted to mention that because these questions for us to talk about were sent, I think probably right after legislative session ended, or maybe a little bit after that. But we're not going to be talking about House Bill 3928 today. However, I did want to go ahead and mention that because I do know that that particular bill which affects dyslexia evaluation, identification, and instruction, is definitely a hot topic of conversation. And so I wanted to mention that from the perspective of, although we're not going to be talking about it today, I did want to just mention a couple of things about it, of course. The main kind of effects of that bill confirm and clarify that dyslexia is a specific learning disability, and that a student's need for dyslexia instruction means that the child is eligible for special education services. And it does require certain professional members to be involved in that evaluation and identification of a student eligible for special education services. So the agency has put out several materials and guidance documents around this particular bill. One of those, of course, is a frequently asked questions document. And we also have kind of a short overview video of the bill itself. So I just wanted to mention that. I believe we can put in the chat the link to where those resources are. So we'll get that to you. But that said, I've talked to SpedTex and to PRN to say if that is something that you would like the agency representatives to come back and talk about in terms of that particular bill and the impacts, we're happy to get that arranged. All right, so I'm going to go through and start with the questions that we've received. And so we'll be talking about that. So we've received three different areas of questions, some questions on the ARD process, so the admission, review, and dismissal process, as well as your individualized education program implementation, your IEP. We've also have a couple of questions on child find, which of course is the federal requirement to locate and identify students with disabilities in your service area, as well as evaluation. Then the bulk of our questions are about House Bill 1416. So House Bill 4545, of course, was passed in the 87th legislative session, which did put some requirements around accelerated instruction for students who did not meet satisfactory performance on the state assessment. And so House Bill 1416 made some changes to that. So we'll talk about the bulk of our questions are in relation to that particular bill. All right, so I will go ahead and get started. And the first question that we received was essentially, how do I work with my school to schedule an ARD committee meeting that works for me if I'm a parent? And so, one of the requirements of the ARD, the ARD committee, is to make sure that they are scheduling meetings at a time and a place that's agreeable to a parent. And so if the date that's proposed, the time and date is proposed that doesn't work for you, then the school is charged with making arrangements to try to find something. One of the things that, I think I've, said before that one of the few positives I think that came out of our pandemic closures is that so many of us have gotten more used to attendance in virtual meetings and in webinars and things like that. And so if neither parent can physically attend, the school can make, that participation available by phone or by video conferencing. So, of course, the suggestion is to just work with your school to let them know that you do want to attend, but you are not able to on those suggested dates. The next question was, I requested an ARD committee meeting and the school declined my request. And so what can I do if the campus is denying the request? So of course, as a parent, you can request an ARD committee meeting to discuss educational concerns at any point. The school then needs to either grant your request or give you kind of written notice of why they are not convening a meeting. So when that, if they refuse to convene the meeting, I would, of course, you have your formal processes for disputes and for disagreements. So it's not always associated with, the dispute around an IEP implementation or anything. So you do have disagreement options in terms of mediation or due process or complaints. However, of course, I do, as a parent of a student, also of a child with a disability, I think that most schools, of course, will. It may not be necessarily a free, appropriate public education or an IEP issue. So, definitely work to see if you can schedule a conference, either with the teacher that you might have issues with, or if it's an overall just kind of, FYI or conversation that you want to have with teachers. So, if, of course, it is specifically about your child's IEP or implementation, and the school refuses, you have your formal disagreement options. But the school should be working with you to try to resolve those. So how often should my child's PLAF be updated? So of course, PLAF stands for Present Levels of Academic Achievement and Functional Performance. That, of course, is a requirement that really, lists your child's strengths and areas of need, and really kind of helps to identify everything else that comes through and comes with the IEP. And so that really helps generate, of course, the annual goals that would be developed and agreed to as well. So that is required to be updated every year. So at every annual review, that needs to be updated. And so I think that right after you have an initial evaluation, or maybe a reevaluation, you may have like a lot of extensive, performance put on those on your PLAF, but the PLAF itself has to be revised at least at every annual. Next question was, we agreed on something in the ARD committee meeting, and when I received my copy of the paperwork, it wasn't reflected in the document. So what are my options for addressing this issue? So it kind of depends on what the something is that was agreed to. So if it is something that's not directly related to like placement or, eligibility, then it could potentially be added into the IEP through what's called an amendment. So that just means that you can kind of add that into the IEP without formally meeting or having another, ARD committee meeting to do that. So of course that would have to, require a parent's agreement to do that, as well as, the other ARD committee members would have to, have that information shared with them. So if it's not reflected, of course, try to see if it can get put in as an amendment. But if it is a specific issue around placement or eligibility, that's not something that can be done through an amendment. And so that would need to be, perhaps another ARD committee meeting called to add that in. All right. So next question was, at the annual ARD committee meeting, a program was developed for my child, but during the year, I noticed my child is not making progress. So what can I do? So again, parents are allowed to ask for an ARD committee meeting at any point. Again, the school has to then respond as to whether they will go ahead and grant that request, or what their reasons are for denying that request. So of course, you have to meet at least annually to discuss the child's progress and performance as well, and develop those annual goals. Of course, you should be receiving your periodic progress reports at least once every grading period for your child-specific IEP goals. If you're noticing that lack of expected progress, I think, traditionally, although, it's not a statutory requirement, but obviously you have a special education teacher or provider that is working with your child or is assigned to your child. So it may be worth reaching out to that person to talk about, get some data and some information from that person, to express those areas of concern, and see if something can be tweaked, or if something can be explained outside of an art committee meeting. But if you need to request one, absolutely do that. Okay, so we have some questions about child find and evaluation. The question was, when can I request an independent educational evaluation? So of course, in our world full of acronyms, independent educational evaluations are called IEEs. So when can you request? You can request, so if you disagree with the school's evaluation, you can request an IEE at the school's expense. So the school has to then give you information about where you can obtain an IEE, and must give you a copy of the school's criteria around their own evaluations and for obtaining an IEE. So whatever, so the IEE itself, of course, has to meet the school's criteria for evaluation. So that's part of that. So if you request that through the school because you disagree with the evaluation, the school either, either has to agree to that, or their option under statute is to request a due process hearing to show that their evaluation is appropriate. So in that case, you can only get one IEE at public expense each time that school conducts an evaluation. So if you disagree with the evaluation, you can ask for one, and then there are steps associated with obtaining that at public expense. Now, of course, you can obtain an IEE at your own expense or the parent's expense, but in terms of having the school pay for it, those are the criteria and procedures associated with that. If the school refuses to do an initial evaluation, what are my options? So how our education code is written is it does require a parent to it doesn't require a parent to submit a written request. I'll change my wording on that. But in terms of a particular timeline for a local education agency to respond to a request, the trigger is a written request. So if a parent makes a written request to the director of special education services or to a district administrative employee for a special ed evaluation, the school has to respond within 15 school days, either saying, okay, yes, we're going to move forward with that evaluation, or no, we're not, and here's why. And so, essentially in that sense, they would, show data that might not support a suspicion of a disability. But in either case, that written request triggers a 15 school day timeline. Now, of course, verbal requests can be made, and districts and schools are typically advised to say, hey, help the parent get that put in writing so that the parameters of that 15 school days apply. But I just wanted to make that clear in terms of written requests prompt that 15-day response. If the school refuses and you disagree with that, of course, you again have those options for dispute resolution and disagreement. And so those can be the state complaint process, due process hearings, and mediation services as well. So you can file that. You should be getting a notice of what we call notice of procedural safeguards, regardless of whether the school says, yes, we'll move forward, or no, we're not. And so that dictates that has information in there to tell you how you can, kind of challenge that decision. All right, so I moved to Texas from out of state. Does my child's new school have to reevaluate my child, or can they use the evaluation and IEP from their previous out-of-state school? So the answer is essentially that the new school, so the Texas school, needs to look over the child's paperwork and the IEP, and hopefully also received a copy of the most recent evaluation. And so the new school decides, is this evaluation and paperwork appropriate for the student? Can we go ahead and implement this? Or do we feel like we need a new evaluation? And so the school has 20 school days to kind of decide that, hey, we think this can be implemented, or no, we need a new evaluation. Of course, during those 20 school days, the school is still required to provide, any comparable services to what your student was receiving at their prior school. If they decide that a new evaluation is needed, then that triggers our initial evaluation timeline. So that's where the 45 school days comes into play with some exception. So the answer is, yes, they can, or kind of yes and no, I guess. They can choose to reevaluate if they feel that the IEP or the evaluation they need to go ahead and evaluate themselves, or they can accept the previous IEP. Now, there are some circumstances where kind of a state to state transfer, the IEP paperwork, eligibility criteria may not be the same, or even the eligibility category may not be the same. And so sometimes that kind of, almost automatically signals to a new school that, yeah, hey, we need to do a new evaluation because it doesn't quite match up with the Texas requirements. But that's something that you would work out with the school in terms of whether they feel a new evaluation or a revised evaluation would need to be done. Next question on child find is just, how do I request an evaluation if I have a preschool child? That is something that, of course, you want to contact the school, where your child, would go to, would start school. So would start public school in kindergarten. So contact that school, potentially ask for, the special education lead or department head, counselor, assistant principal, somewhere, some kind of campus lead who can explain that process to you. But the best approach I would advise is to contact the school that your child will be going to when they start kindergarten or first grade if you decide not to go to kindergarten, and they can help you through that process. All right, so here's the bulk of our questions in relation to 1416. So what is House Bill 1416? When does it take effect is the first question. And how is it different from HB 4545? So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, House Bill 4545 was passed during the 2021 session in the 87th Texas legislature. And that put in some very specific requirements around accelerated instruction for students who did not perform satisfactorily on STAR assessments. And so that so there were very specific requirements in relation to that. What HB 1416 did was it just revised some of those requirements. Still has some pretty prescriptive accelerated instruction requirements, but did modify some of the rather strict and almost kind of hard to implement pieces of what House Bill 4545 put into place. So essentially, kind of the bigger pieces of what's changed in between the two is that it's taken out this formal committee called the Accelerated Learning Committee. So under 4545, that was required, right after kind of this first failure, and there was kind of a very formal approach to it. So 1416 took out that specific committee, but still, of course, requires the provision of accelerated instruction. What it also did is it essentially requires accelerated instruction on the surface for all subject failures of STAR. However, if you have a student who failed to perform satisfactorily on more than 2 assessments, and let's say a fifth grader in this example did not pass reading, math, or science, then what the district is obligated to do is prioritize that reading and math. So they don't have to provide the accelerated instruction for the science. because the state wants them to focus on reading and math. Okay. So it also reduced, part of accelerated instruction, kind of the definition within the law, is that accelerated instruction can be either placing a student with a very well qualified teacher, meaning that we have a kind of state almost like leveling process through our teacher incentive allotment, where there are particular levels of teachers that have demonstrated, mastery of their content, their teaching practices and everything. So accelerated instruction can be placing a student with that teacher, or it has to be the provision of what's called supplemental instruction. Supplemental instruction is what we are kind of used to for purposes of 45-45, where it said, 30 hours in that subject area, has to be a ratio of, 3 students to 1 tutor, and very, some other specifics. What 1416 did is, for some students, reduced that hour requirement to 15. And it did raise the ratio up from 1 to 3 to 4, or 1 to 4. So, of course, it still maintains that a parent can waive that ratio to allow for a larger group. One thing I want to point out specifically about sort of how this relates to special education is that under the provisions under 45-45, there was a very specific requirement for an ARD committee to decide the accelerated instruction or the supplemental instruction. In this case, what 1416 did is, because this isn't necessarily, this isn't always related to a child's IEP or the provision of free appropriate public education. What this change in 1416 does is that an ARD committee doesn't have to meet to determine this. Essentially, the hours are the hours, the requirements are the requirements, and that's in place for every student. However, there is, of course, a provision in there that an ARD committee could meet if they feel like a student's IEP needs to be modified based on these accelerated instruction requirements. So, and that can be, of course, the district initiating that, or a parent asking for an ARD. But basically, the main piece here is that an ARD committee is not always required if you have a student subject to accelerated instruction. It just they are essentially provided accelerated instruction as is any other student, unless the district or the parent requests and the district grants an ARD committee to discuss revision. So the next question to that is, can a parent refuse the accelerated instruction? So there was some, there wasn't a very specific sort of opt-out or modification carved out under 45-45 for a parent to say, I don't want my child doing this. So under 1416, there is a specific permission, or kind of a statute or a section that allows a parent to modify or remove any requirement of accelerated instruction. So that could be any or all of the accelerated or supplemental instruction. In order to do that, or to request that change, the student either has to have a STAR assessment score that indicates failure to perform satisfactorily, or let's say the child may not have taken the STAR. They are automatically in this pool of students who have to have accelerated instruction if a student did not take STAR or doesn't have a score for STAR from the previous year. So in order for a parent in those cases, when you don't have a STAR score, to ask for, either opting out entirely or modifying, a student has to have been administered a beginning of year assessment. So a school district or a school would need to administer some type of beginning of year assessment to kind of show the student's proficiency, and assign the accelerated instruction based on that. And then the parent, has that right or option to make a modification or opt that child out. can my child be pulled out of his or her main classes or extracurricular activities to receive accelerated instruction? So the education code specifically mentions that students cannot be removed from what they call foundation curriculum, which is really your core courses, your core curriculum, or from enrichment curriculum. And those are your typically, the other either, some of that falls under extracurriculars, as well as your, health and other areas. So they cannot be removed also from recess. So students cannot be removed from recess or from the core curriculum or from that enrichment. That would include electives that are normally provided to students in that grade level. So that is something that the requirement is not to remove students from those areas. The next question was essentially if my school provides that accelerated instruction before or after school hours, are they required to provide transportation? So the law reads that yes, transportation would have to be provided unless the district doesn't operate or contract for transportation. So if the district, which we have districts, of course, that don't operate transportation systems, but otherwise, if the district does, and they require that attendance before or after school to get that accelerated instruction done, then they do have to offer transportation. All right. So how do schools know which students need accelerated instruction? And so that has to do, of course, with the STAR scores. So you're looking at STAR scores, and there's different levels, of course, of, kind of mastery of STAR scores. So if a student does not achieve at least an approaches grade level on, any STAR in grades 3 through 8 or your end of course assessments, if they don't achieve at least the approaches grade level, then they are required to receive accelerated instruction during that next year. So again, it applies for all courses, all tests. But again, remember what I said earlier in terms of if they fail, kind of more than 2, then districts just have to prioritize and complete the reading and math. Those are the 2 areas that they have to focus on. So 15 hours of supplemental instruction, if that's the route of accelerated instruction. So 15 hours is required, except what the agency has determined, because the law does allow the agency to say, 15 hours, unless, and the agency can determine, areas or issues or criteria that may require 30 hours. And so in this case, you have 15 hours, but if the student scores in what's called the low does not meet category of STAR performance, then the requirement on the district is to provide no less than 30 hours. The other agency decision there is that if you have a 3rd grader and they, did not meet at least approaches, then they need to have 30 hours. So it's, essentially 15 hours, unless you have that low does not meet category or a 3rd grader going into 4th grade, then that 30 hours is required. 30 hours is also required when you have, and we'll go through that here in a second, when you have what's called the accelerated education plan, and that's when that's when that student has failed more than 2 or more consecutive years. And so we'll talk about that here in a second. So I mentioned this. So what's considered performing satisfactorily? So that means that if a student scores either at approaches grade level, meets grade level, or master's grade level, then that means they've passed. So if they have the does not meet, then that means they are required to participate. All right. If my child took STAR Alt 2, so the STAR alternate 2, does he or she have to complete accelerated instruction? This was the other change, kind of the larger change in terms of special education that House Bill 1416 made. It did clarify that these requirements associated with accelerated instruction do not apply to students who were administered STAR Alt 2. So in those cases, there is no need to, if a parent wanted to opt out or anything like that, there is not that need, because accelerated instruction does not apply to students who took STAR Alt 2. So that's a change in 1416. All right. So when is the school required to develop an accelerated instruction plan? So I mentioned that here in a minute ago. And what must it contain? And will I receive a copy of the plan? And does an ARD committee meeting have to develop the plan? So essentially, it's called an accelerated education plan. So when a student does not meet grade level or does not meet satisfactory performance on 2 or more consecutive school years of STAR in that particular subject, there has to be an accelerated education plan developed. Now, again, I said earlier, the formal committee is no longer required. The formal ARD meeting is no longer required. However, this plan still has to be developed and still communicated with the parent. So basically, that plan is supposed to identify, why the student didn't perform satisfactorily. And that also is where at least 30 hours would come into play for that next kind of round of supplemental instruction or accelerated instruction. So an ARD committee, again, does not have to meet to determine that unless, again, the ARD committee feels like an IEP might need to be modified because of these requirements. And so a question is, well, how will I know if a student is getting accelerated instruction, and am I going to get progress updates, and is it shared in the ARD committee? So kind of, several issues here, but essentially, if you have a child who, is subject to accelerated instruction because they did not perform satisfactorily on the STAR, the school does have to provide notice to a parent. Preferably, the statute says at a parent-teacher conference. If that's not doable, then by another method, they have to send notice to the parent that the student is not performing on grade level. And so the agency has posted a model notice for that notification. And you can find that. I think I forgot to mention at the beginning on accelerated instruction, we do have a page, of course, reserved for accelerated education and accelerated instruction, which includes a frequently asked questions document. So a lot of these questions are addressed there if you want to check that. So when you have that accelerated education plan, again, that's the 2 or more consecutive years of failure on STAR. The district, again, needs to make an effort to provide information to the parent at a parent-teacher conference. But of course, either way, when you get here, you've got to provide the student's parent kind of more explanation of why this accelerated education plan is being developed, how they can help participate in that development. And then that copy of the plan would then be provided to the parent. And then the school is required to monitor that student's progress on the accelerated education plan. One thing I did want to mention, of course, without that formal ARD committee requirement to determine accelerated instruction, there is, of course, now a requirement at the next kind of annual ARD committee meeting. The ARD committee would then just discuss a student's progress or performance on accelerated instruction if he or she was subject to that accelerated instruction. So not the formal requirement for the ARD committee to determine it, but there is a requirement at the next annual IEP meeting to talk about it, to talk about how the student is participating and progressing in that instruction. All right, so what is the difference between intensive program of instruction and accelerated instruction? So intensive programs of instruction, they are required under a different statute. So, of course, again, acronyms, we call these IPIs. So IPIs are required for two reasons. Number one is if a student fails to perform satisfactorily on a STAR assessment, or if a district determines that a student is not likely to graduate in 4 years. So one thing that is sometimes kind of difficult in implementation is that IPI statute has been in place for many years, and it hasn't been adjusted in many years. However, of course, the accelerated instruction chapter, which we see in House Bill 1416, has become much more sophisticated and much more prescriptive as far as what's required. So as opposed to thinking about several years ago where there really wasn't a very prescriptive process for either IPIs or accelerated instruction, we now have kind of this existing IPI and very kind of robust requirements under accelerated instruction. So what the agency has determined and kind of set up guidance around is that if the IPI, if you have a student with, receiving special education services, if you have a student that needs an IPI because of failure of STAR, as long as the district complies with the accelerated instruction requirements, under that law, then there's no real expectation of developing some specific IPI. Because in reality, it really was to develop a plan of intensive supports, of course, as the name alludes, but the accelerated instruction does meet that criteria. So that said, and I think either Huck or someone can kind of put a link as far as where that guidance is listed. And I'm sorry for kind of doing my my daughter is calling me from school and she keeps calling. So I just want to make sure we're not in an emergency, so I apologize. All right, so next question. If a high school student is served by special education and does not pass an EOC assessment, and the ARD committee determines that a passing score on the assessment is not required, is that accelerated instruction required? The answer is yes, after that initial administration. So that first administration of STAR or the STAR EOC, and they failed to demonstrate satisfactory performance, the accelerated instruction is required, but it is not required in subsequent years or subsequent administrations because the student wouldn't be taking that assessment at that point. So that's not required, but it is after the first. All right. So I know that I talked fast to try to get through all of them, but that was the end of our questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're happy to work with SpedTex and PRN to get back here with additional questions and try to address those the best we can. So I appreciate you being here and for having us, for sure.
Thank you, Kristin. Sarah, I believe you're on mute still.
I am. Thank you. I just noticed that. Thank you, Kristin, so much for being here. I think those are Zoom problems. You'd think we would be used to them by now, but every once in a while they sneak up. Anyway, thank you to everyone for your time today. We are going to go back to Stephanie McLaughlin to share some additional information about Partners Resource Network.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us today. Just want to remind you that we are available if you have questions. Our regionally located coordinators are available to help you with any of those. We have a lot of information available on our website, so be sure and check it out at prntexas.org and check out our upcoming events in your local area and our upcoming webinars under resources. Thank you.
And if you have questions about special education, you can contact us at SpedTex, your source for special education information, and we are happy to help. Our contact information is on the screen. We are going to stop recording now.